Hey guys, welcome to the CU Atlas channel. I'm Mitchell and I'm going to be going through some basic photography stuff today, kind of going through your camera, looking at different settings, how to kind of adjust exposure stuff in a bunch of different ways, stuff like that. Of course, if you have any questions, just put that into chat. I'll try to look at that and answer your questions. So yeah. Okay, so first thing about your camera, style on the top. There's a bunch of different settings. We're going to go through all of them. But the first thing we got to know really is what you're looking for. So you want to go through these to based on what kind of exposure you want, which different parameters that you want to control that exposure. So if we just go through the top right here, these ones within this little bracket are the ones I'm just going to be going through. M is for manual, A is for aperture priority, S is for shutter priority, and P is for program. So we're going to be going through each of those. Each of them controls its own different part of exposure, which exposure is basically how you're in, like how light or dark the image that you take is. You can control that through a bunch of different ways. And each of those is controlled differently by one of these different modes. So when you're thinking about taking a picture, you want to pick the mode that best suits the picture that you want to get, while also thinking about the way that you want the picture overall to be exposed, whether you want it to be dark or you want it to be light. So the different pieces that go into exposure are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. So let's go through each of those. Shutter speed is pretty self-explanatory. It's how fast the shutter on your camera goes, like how long it's actually open. So if I turn on my camera, and you'll be able to hear the shutter go, so it's pretty fast, or you can make it really slow. And what this does is, obviously, the longer the shutter is opened, the more exposure the picture gets. So it'll be a lot brighter. If it's open for less time, then it'll be a lot darker. This makes mostly sense when you think about it. And so the exposure part of shutter speed really isn't the hard thing. It's figuring out what you want to do with that shutter speed. If you want to freeze the motion, then you're going to want to use a really fast shutter speed. So something that's, hundredth of a second, or even faster than that. But if you want motion to be blurred, maybe you want to take a picture of a bus that's going by you and you want it to be blurred, or maybe like a train, and you want that to be blurred. Well, then you have to kind of think about, well, how much blur do I actually want in the picture? How long do I want the shutter to be open to capture that amount of motion? But then you have to think about, if it's open for longer, you're getting more exposure, so the picture will start getting brighter. You can compensate for that by using the other two parameters that control exposure. But before thinking about that, you just kind of want to think about, well, if I want it to also be that long, thinking about the motion of the camera. Not only is the object that you're taking a picture of moving, but your hands are moving around. So the first thing to really take into consideration when you're shooting with a camera that you're thinking about the shutter speed is my shutter speed fast enough for me to actually be able to handhold the camera? So if you look at these settings right here, this is the shutter speed on my camera. 1/5 of a second is what that means. And that really is too long for me to hold the camera without there being some kind of shake. And so when you're thinking about taking that picture, maybe that's the amount of blur you want for the object that you're taking a picture of, but it's not really a doable picture when you think about your hands shaking around. So to compensate for that, you can obviously just put it on a table or use a tripod or something like that. But it's just something to kind of keep in mind when you're taking a picture that has a long shutter speed. So that's shutter speed basically. The next one that we're going to talk about is aperture. Aperture confuses a lot of people just because it's measured in kind of a weird way. So aperture basically is the size of the opening of the lens that you're using to take the picture. So I have here an old lens. Hopefully you'll be able to see this. But if I look inside of it, there's an opening that you can open and close. This one you do it manually. In most cameras now you just tell it to digitally do that, and it'll change it as you're taking the picture. So as it's bigger, all the way open up, you're letting in more light. That makes mostly sense. The bigger the hole, the more light that's coming in. If you lower it, then less light's coming in. But these have kind of a weird way to be measured, as I mentioned before. The bigger the opening, the smaller the f-stop number. And I don't know if you've seen this on a lens. It'll be an f/ some kind of number. It's actually denoted on the lens itself what's the maximum aperture that it can go to. So on a lens like this one that's on my camera right now, it says f3.5 to f5.6. That's actually denoting a difference in how the aperture opens based on the length of the lens. But if we think about that 3.5, that's basically as wide as it will go. But if I look at this lens, it actually goes on to 2.5, so it actually gets wider than the other one. And so it'll let in more light when the aperture is up like that. Lenses are pretty much all different in terms of how wide open they can get, but they can all close down to a certain amount that's in anywhere between about f18 to f22. They're all fairly similar. So that's basically the exposure part of aperture. The bigger it is open with a smaller f number means more exposure for that image. If you go the other way, if it's smaller with a higher f number, something like f18, the less light that's coming in to the lens, to your like into the camera, and that'll be less exposure for the overall image. And so you have to take that kind of into account when taking a picture. But the bigger thing to think about with aperture, besides kind of controlling the exposure bit, is how deep do you want the depth of field to be in an image. And that's what actually aperture controls overall. So when you think of an image that has a very small depth of field, you think of maybe like a flower where everything in the background is blurred. That has a very shallow depth of field. And that is created by having a bigger aperture, so the hole is bigger. F number is smaller, something f1.8, f2.5, something around that. And so you have to think about that when you're taking a picture. do you want the depth of field to be smaller or bigger, and adjusting the aperture accordingly. We're going to go through this more in depth later when I'm actually going to be taking some pictures and showing you guys kind of the different things that happen. But then also thinking about if the aperture is bigger and to get that shallow depth of field, what happens to the shutter speed? If you're taking in a lot of light with the aperture, you don't want the picture to be overexposed, so you need to decrease the shutter speed in order to compensate for that. So make it faster. So light is coming in for a less of the amount of time that's coming in. So that's when you're thinking about exposure overall. That's kind of what you have to think about, is just which kind of effect do you want? Do you want large depth of field, small depth of field? Do you want the motion to be blurred, or do you want it to be very sharp? And taking those into account, you look at your different parameters and change those based on what you want, but also taking into account whether or not that is going to give you an overexposed or underexposed image based on how much light is coming in. So if we look at the camera with these different settings, we have shutter priority and aperture priority, and we'll pick one of these based on which kind of picture you want to take. So if I want to take a picture with a really low depth of field, well, that's controlled by aperture. So I'll switch that to the A on here, and then I'll look at my settings, and it'll give me an F number, and right now it's at F16, but that isn't what I want if I want a lower depth of field. So I'm going to decrease the F number right here in order to make it so that the aperture is more wide open, so that gets a shallower depth of field. I've already said that's for pictures basically where you want to blur something in the background. So portraits or flowers, a lot of stylized images do that. However, if I want to go the other way, up to something like F18, that will make it so there's a very long depth of field. So I'm getting basically every single thing in the entire picture in focus. And that's really useful for stuff like landscapes, where you want every little tree to be in focus completely. So just think about what kind of picture you want to take, and then adjust the number accordingly. So then we think about this other one on the shutter speed here. Right now it's at 1/3 of a second, and it's long because in aperture priority, when I'm controlling only the aperture, it's going to pick a shutter speed that it thinks will give you the proper exposure. So because my F number is very large, meaning the hole itself for the lens is small, it has to compensate by having the shutter open for longer just to get the proper exposure for that. But as you watch, as I increase the size of the aperture by decreasing the F number, the shutter speed is slowly getting faster in order to compensate for kind of the exposure to make that the proper exposure overall. Now these pictures, as I go through any of those pictures that I took at any of those f-stops or any of those shutter speeds, they would have been the same exact exposure, with the difference of the amount of blur based on the shutter speed and the depth of field based on the aperture. So on the flip side, if I shift this into shutter priority mode, then I'm controlling directly the shutter speed, but the aperture is changing in order to compensate for that, so that the exposure overall is the correct one, at least in terms of what the camera thinks. So those are the two main pieces of photography exposure that you have to think about when taking a picture. And mostly when at least I go around, I stick to one of those two, depending on what kind of picture I want to take. You can basically just kind of sit in those two and take almost, 95% of your pictures will be in those two, at least if you want to think about changing those. But there's a third different parameter that I mentioned before, the ISO, that is part of this kind of exposure triangle that the camera kind of takes into consideration as it judges the exposure of the image. And this last one, the ISO, is actually, when you look at the sensor of a camera, it's behind the shutter. When it takes in light, it's it's getting these different pixel ratings, but you can actually change how sensitive that sensor is to the light itself in order to make it so that if maybe you're shooting in the dark, it's more sensitive to the light coming in. If you're shooting in the middle of the day where it's really bright, you want it to be less sensitive. And so that's what ISO is. It's basically the sensitivity of the sensor in your camera. This is here on your camera, at least on mine. It's the ISO right here. Mine right now is at 1,000. That's not really a really normal one. The base number is 100. And this means that it is not very sensitive to light at all. You would choose this kind of rating if you wanted to shoot at in like the middle of the day, because you don't want it to be really sensitive. In here, it's actually causing kind of an issue because indoors it's actually darker than you really think it is. So it's saying that the subject is too dark. It's not actually able to compensate enough to give you a well-exposed image. It's actually saying right here that I'm underexposed a little bit. To deal with that, I can increase the ISO. And now the sensor in my camera is more sensitive to light. So that can help definitely when it's darker in the room, or if you're shooting at night, this will help. The rating on this camera goes up a lot, up to these high values, which are in, multiple thousands. You don't really have to worry about the number. You just kind of have to worry about kind of where you are in the ISO range. But as you increase the ISO on a camera, the amount of noise in your picture increases. That's why you see a lot of pictures that are like at night and they seem really noisy. Like there's little orange specks or purple specks, or there's just like this layer of kind of like weird choppiness across the image. That's because the ISO was too high, which probably was needed to get the exposure of the overall image correct, but it screws up the image because it adds all of that noise to it. And it's doing that because the sensor itself, as it's getting those values, it's amplifying them because it's more sensitive, but that sometimes can get pixels to be too bright, or it just kind of like leaves pixels messed up when you do that. So you really have to think about what your ISO should be to get that exposure that you want without overdoing it and adding too much noise. And this really is a camera by camera kind of thing. You have to experiment with it. My camera here, I generally don't go above 3200, or else it adds too much noise to my images. But of course, if I wanted that noise in, then maybe I do want to increase the ISO. So yeah, that's the third parameter. And you just taking all that into account with aperture and shutter speed is what you really have to do to think about the kind of picture that you want. Do you want it to be noisy or not noisy? Do you want it to have a small field of depth of view or a long one? Do you want to have blurred motion or not? And think about those for each picture that you take in order to take the picture that you want. So yeah, that's everything that goes really into exposure. And you have to think about those as you're taking them. And I'll show you each of those in a little bit and kind of what they're doing in terms of like an exact picture to kind of give you an idea of what exactly those are doing. But before I do that, there's 2 more modes on the dial here that I did not go through. So on below shutter priority on mine is the P, which is for program. And if you look as I'm just like going around it, I mean you can't really see it that well, but it will try to pick at just a good exposure in general. But it doesn't favor shutter speed or aperture in any way. It does it just to figure out which one. Like it just shifts both of them until it gets a picture that has the correct exposure. So if you want to go around and take a picture that is just well exposed overall, you don't want to worry about like thinking about those, then you put it into program mode and you just walk around and shoot. And that could be a really good way. I mean, if you're just on vacation and you just want to go take a bunch of good pictures, put it in program mode. It will mess with your shutter speed and aperture and take a well-exposed image. Now, you may have noticed I didn't say that it shifts the ISO because it doesn't. And I think that's a good thing because randomly adding noise to your images I don't think is a good thing. You want to be able to control that. So the only thing that you really have control of in program is the ISO. But generally, I mean, if you're going to be shooting in the same basic lighting, so if you're just shooting outdoors all day, you just set it to a low number. Shooting indoors all day, set it up to like a mid to high number, and you'll basically be set for the whole day. Of course, you have to remember to change that if you go outside, if you were indoors, or vice versa, and change that. So then the last of the 4 that you want to look at is the M, which is for manual. And manual is exactly what it sounds like. You have complete control over absolutely everything on your camera. It won't try to compensate for anything in order to adjust the exposure to make that better for you. You have to decide whether or not the picture you're going to take is over or underexposed. My camera does give me a little kind of range about where it thinks the exposure should be, but of course that gets really inaccurate if you're shooting in the straight dark or something where you actually do need to take control over every single parameter. That's not really going to help you. Reasons to go into manual are in shooting conditions where your camera is very confused. It's very dark or it's crazy bright, and it just doesn't know what to do to get the picture that you really want, because it doesn't really know what you're thinking. So if you wanted to shoot into the dark, it can't see anything, unless of course you adjust the settings to where it can see, but it's not going to go to those settings by itself. Where you're going to hit shutter speeds that are multiple seconds or longer, for example. So manual is mostly for those very specific situations. You don't really go just to manual, like if you're, I'm a good photographer, you don't go to manual mode. You go to manual mode when it's some situation that just like your camera has no idea what it's doing. Other than that, you really don't go to it. I mean, so it's not, don't think of manual as like advanced photography. It's no more advanced than any of the other of the modes that I've been talking about. It's mostly just to go to in those special situations where you need it. Otherwise, it doesn't take better pictures than the other modes. So, yeah, I mean, you just gotta have to know when to be in each different mode. So next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually switch the stream around so that you guys can see the pictures that I'm taking. instead of just me talking at you. And I'll kind of just like discuss what is happening in each of them. Obviously, ask questions if you have any, or you want me to go over something. And so, yeah. Okay, so what I'm basically doing now is I went to Lightroom, which is an Adobe program that I use to edit photos, and I'm going into something called tethered mode, where basically any picture that I take will be downloaded immediately off my camera and go straight into the computer so that you guys can see it. So I'm just going to basically do a tutorial. I guess that's what this is. I'm just going to put it in a folder. On the desktop. Just name them whatever. And it detects my camera. D5200 is the name of my camera, if you care. And it'll show the different settings that I have going on. Just so kind of, I mean, obviously so that you guys can see, but also each of the images will be popping up. So let me move this down here. And they'll pop up into here. Let me do a test shot just to make sure that's going. So here is my first image. Obviously it's pretty derpy, but now you guys can just kind of see as soon as I take a picture, it will kind of shift what I'm just trying to show what I'm looking at. So the first thing I'm going to do is switch it into aperture priority mode. And I'm going to decrease the aperture as much as this lens will allow at the length that I'm shooting at in order to get a larger depth of field. Not a smaller depth of field, that's my bad. And so, oh gosh, it's so blurry. Loading. Let me retake that. Okay, not much better. Sorry, I need to actually up my ISO because the shutter speed is being really low and it's actually on the wobbles from me actually hitting the shutter button. It's messing up the picture. Okay, there we go. So we can see that I focused on the lens here, and it is completely in focus, but the background is very out of focus, which is just what we wanted. If I look over at what settings it was at, f4.8, which actually isn't that low, but it's low enough that it will create this smaller depth of field overall. And so that's basically what we wanted. If I then, whoops, increase the f-stop right here, if you're seeing it's at f18 now, that actually bumped it up to a second in compensation because I'm in aperture priority mode right now. And I'm focusing on exactly the same point. If I take that image and I look at this picture, not only is the lens completely in focus, but the background is also in focus, at least enough. It goes back to around here instead of in this other one where it's basically this little sliver on the picture. So that's basically what you're looking at when you're taking aperture, images that are based basically off the aperture. Is just like picking high or low based on if you want the smaller depth of field or the bigger depth of field. So next I'm switching over to shutter priority mode. And I'm going to first, obviously if you just leave it how it is, if I take a very fast shutter picture, I say fast, a 60th of a second, and that comes up and everything is obviously in focus. Everything is not moving, it was fast. I'm actually going to switch over and do this. So let me switch lenses actually. So I can hit a faster shutter speed because the lens I'm going to switch to actually has a bigger aperture than the other one. So I'll be able to shoot faster. Let me test. Now got test that. Okay, we're just going to kind of ignore that picture. So this lens I switched to actually has a max aperture of 1.8 as opposed to the 3.5 on the other one, which means not only can the depth of field be a lot smaller, but if I'm sitting at that lower depth of field, I can actually hit a faster shutter speed without having to resort to messing with the ISO too much. You could have seen my settings change down here. Now I'm going to sit at just an f2 so that my shutter speed is really fast. And now what I'm going to do, I'm going to actually be moving my hand in front of the lens to show you what the faster shutter speed is going to be doing. So we got a certain amount of blur right there, and that's at 1/160th of a second. But then if I go the other way and I'm decreasing this to like a 20th of a second, I'm moving my hand about the same speed. Then we got a lot more motion right here. And so that's basically what the shutter speed is doing. It's just if it's open for longer, then it's going to get this big blur across. And so you can think about which one do you want. Do you want it to be absolutely pristine? Then you really have to bump up like how fast it's going in order to capture that moment. So I mean, even like a bird or something, I was obviously going to be moving even faster than my hand was, and my hand is already blurring at 1/160th of a second. So you're going to have to move that up to, I mean, a 1/400th, 1/1000th, or even more than that, just to get the speed that you need to capture that motion. Whereas if you're wanting to blur something, you can decrease it down to a lower shutter speed in order to get the blur that you want.
How's the stream?
It's going all right. It's not very chatty.
No. Anybody there?
Yeah. 5 people.
Nice. Let's find you.
So now let's experiment with the ISO in order to kind of show what that's doing. So most of these pictures that I've been taking are at a very low ISO. So if I decrease that and just take a picture, then it's obviously very pristine. Then if I move the ISO way up to, I mean, numbers that I would never shoot with normally, and that comes in, and you can see this kind of weird like noise going around. If we zoom into that, you can definitely see this noise right here. And I mean, it's not terrible in here, but especially if you're like shooting at night, there'll be all kinds of weird glowing pixels around.
Should we turn the lights on?
Nah, it's not that big of a deal. But on the other hand, if you want to, you can kind of use the high ISO rating to get good test shots in the dark. If you're not sure that the picture that you're going to take is going to be like of something that you actually want to take a picture of, so if you're shooting a picture of a mountain in the dark, but you actually can't really see the mountain, unless you turn your shutter speed all the way up to like 30 seconds, then maybe you want to increase your ISO up all the way to take a test shot, even though that picture that you take with the test ISO will be super grainy and like crazy. You'll still be able to see basically what you're looking at, so that on the next picture that you take, you can adjust the settings accordingly, lower the ISO back down, increase your shutter speed, and take the picture that will be the good one. So, yeah. Is there any questions from the chat? You guys have been pretty quiet. Oh, he's our buddy. We signed up for him, so he like moderates our channel for us.
Nice.
And then he'll post random things, but we haven't given him anything to say yet.
Stick me, Sarah, and Nightbot. I have to go meet a student.
Okay.
You need help with the stuff.
No, I'm pretty set up with my crazy wires.
You're ripping it right now. You're like in the command center. Sweet. Yeah, shoot me a text or Slack message if you need help.
Okay. So I don't use a whole lot of lighting when I shoot. I don't really. I mean, I have a flash, but flashes are actually for not really changing exposure. It's actually for filling in shadows. That's really what lighting is for, like extra lighting. So if you ever think about taking just like a portrait of somebody, they're really thinking about where they want the shadows on the face to be. So you put the main light on either side to kind of create shadows across. But then you're using another flash to kind of fill in the shadow on the other side because you don't want it to be this really big contrast across somebody's face. You basically just want it to be kind of this soft shadow. Think about like a rainy day where everything really is, it's kind of this uncontrasty kind of shadow, or like if you're just like under a tree or something. So you can kind of create that effect with additional flash. I do have one for my camera, like a big one. So you'll just, as you're shooting at somebody, you will actually just put the flash on the side where the light, like the shadow is being created. So if you're shooting and like the sun's off to your like right or something, you'll put flash on the other side in order to fill in the shadow that's right there. You're not actually creating a whole lot of extra light. You're just kind of filling in a little bit to kind of even out the exposure. So that's basically for like portrait shooting. If I'm shooting at night, I'll just use like a flashlight or something to fill in light. Because when you're doing like night shooting, you actually want to make sure everything is pretty even. So you use a flashlight and you just kind of like wave it across where the picture is. It sounds kind of goofy, but it actually gets really good results once you kind of get the hang of not leaving the light in one spot for too long. So yeah, that's basically what I use for lighting. It's not a whole lot. Next thing that I was going to talk about is the overall kind of range of a picture, like the dynamic range. So when you look at a picture, there's this difference between like something that's like in the shadows. So over here in this shadow, something that's black, like the lens itself, or something that's really light, like the table or this box right here. And this, when you're thinking about that, that actually corresponds directly to the histogram, which in Lightroom is up in the upper right corner. And you can kind of see this data is spread across right here. And what it's doing is basically showing you how much of the picture is in these different exposure points on the picture. So down here on the left is where it's dark or black. And in this picture, there's a decent amount. There's this kind of this lump right here, which will be the lens, this box back here, and this like shadowy area. And then this kind of bleeds up into this brighter section, these couple little lumps, which will be the box and the table. And you can use this information on the histogram to kind of decide whether your picture is over or underexposed. And also kind of, if you don't really want these huge spikes, you kind of want this like data over the entire image, of course, unless you actually want something to be like sticking out like a bunch in the middle, like in a black, like, I don't know, you have somebody in like a white dress against a black background, then obviously you're gonna have these big lumps. So let's take a look at that. Actually, in terms of pictures, I mean, you can see how it changes between all of these. The colored ones are actually just the color channels in the picture because they're just taking up, each picture is just of the three different, it's red, blue, and green, so just RGB. So those are what those lumps are, and then, yeah. So, going back to my camera, there's actually, it won't let me kind of overexpose stuff on purpose in most of the modes. If I go to manual, it'll let me do whatever I want though. So if I decrease the ISO back down, first let's get a very underexposed image, and we'll kind of look at the histogram there. That is very underexposed. That's like crazy underexposed. So you can see here, all of that is on the left. There is nothing there at all. That's generally not what you'll see, though on occasion. So if looking at my settings, if I want to increase the exposure overall, I'm going to make my aperture bigger by lowering the number. So let's go all the way to the max, which is not quite. Let me still make it underexposed. So this picture is a little bit better, but it's still pretty underexposed. It's almost all black or very dark gray, and that's obviously telltale that it's underexposed just by looking at it. But if you look at the histogram here, everything is on this bottom like quarter, and that is no good at all. If we go to the flip side, and let me increase my ISO, make aperture as big as possible, and crazy overexposed. So super white, obviously not a good picture. On the histogram, everything is just the stuff over on the right. So everything is either pure white on this far edge, or it's very, very light gray. Something to kind of also notice about this histogram is, I mean, if you look at these different pictures, like this one's pure black, this one has a lot of pure white. Those are called either blown out highlights, or just like you lose your detail in your blacks right here. And what that's telling you is that there's actually, the data has so skewed that there's nothing there anymore. Whereas a picture like this actually isn't so dark that it can't be rescued, which we'll go through a little bit later. Just kind of how to rescue kind of weirdly exposed images. This one has a lot of overblown white over here, and so you can't fix that either. Let's take a slightly less exposed image, so it's not crazy white. And so this one, once again, it's bright, but it's not so bright that you can't like fix it at all. I mean, it's overexposed, but you can definitely mess with this to get the exposure that you want. And so thinking about if you want something to be over or underexposed is an interesting kind of thing, because your camera has this idea of what is properly exposed, but you may not think that that is the correct way to expose that particular image. Maybe you want an image where something goes to pure black, because at that exposure, you're actually giving detail back to the clouds, because otherwise they would have been pure white if you went the other way. And what you're calling that, I mean, what everybody calls that is the dynamic range of your camera, whether or not you can actually fit the whole scene in one picture. There are ways to get around that. But you kind of have to think about what is the final way that you want to do that. Maybe you do want a lot of detail to be lost, or maybe you want something to be blown out just because. Or maybe your camera is not actually giving you the correct exposure. All cameras nowadays have something called exposure compensation, which when you're in aperture priority, shutter priority, or program mode, you can actually tell the camera that you want it to overexpose or underexpose based on what you think the actual exposure of that image should be. This can be done to kind of fix images in the way that you think it should be done artistically, or it can be done because your camera is just not getting a very good reading, or it's actually reading the wrong part of the image that you want. So if you're trying to take a picture of all of your friends under a very bright sky, maybe it's actually thinking that you want to expose for the sky and not your friends, so it's making them very black because it's having to underexpose for the sky. So exposure compensation is a way to kind of get around that and tell your camera that, yes, I still want to be in shutter, aperture, priority modes, or program. I don't want to go into manual to take over everything, but I still want to have just a smidge more control in order to kind of fix those common problems. And so yeah, and you can tell it to kind of overexpose or underexpose a certain amount. That's called a stop. A stop of light on a camera is basically how much light is coming in. If you go up one stop, it doubles the amount of light. If you go down one stop, it halves the amount of light. You don't really need to know that. You just kind of need to know about how much brighter is one stop over, or how much darker is it going down one. So just kind of keeping that in the back of your mind, you can fix images pretty much immediately after you take them. You say, oh, this image actually was too dark. Let me tell my camera to overexpose by one stop over what it thinks it should be doing, because I know that that's actually going to give it that brightness that I need in the end. And so thinking about that is a great way to shoot out in the field for pictures that you will be able to come back with and do a lot of cool things with. So now I'm going to kind of switch over into editing a little bit, at least using Lightroom, because Lightroom basically is for editing images using, it's like pushing around the data that it's giving you from taking that picture. So in Lightroom right here, let's go back to one of these. Yeah, let's go with this guy. So if I go over to the develop module, it'll give me a bunch of tools for messing with this image as it came in. So if we look over here, we see this histogram, big thing of black right here, which is obviously the lens, and a little bit of this stuff underneath the table right here. And then this lump of higher exposure, which is the table. And we can mess with those to kind of look at how it's affecting the picture in terms of exposure. So if I go over here, there is actually an exposure knob that will do, it's basically exactly what you think it's going to do. It's going to increase the exposure, or it's going to decrease the exposure. And if you look at the number over to the right of what I'm adjusting, it goes plus or minus 5 stops of exposure. So that's doubling or having the light 5 times. And this is super duper useful for messing with pictures after the fact, where maybe you didn't realize that your picture was a little bit over or a little bit under. And so it can help deal with those things. But what this cannot do is help those images where the highlights are actually blown out, or the lower end, the blacks, have lost all their detail. And we can look at that in another picture. In this one, if you look at the histogram as I move this, it's pushing the data around in the histogram. Now, if I go too far over one way, it'll either blow out the highlights or lose all detail in the shadows if I go the other way. And you can see that up in the histogram by these bars that shoot up on the far sides. And what Lightroom actually is pretty cool is it'll actually show, so yeah, shadow clipping is where it's losing that detail. And that's in this dark blue. You can see that there actually isn't any more data there if I lower the exposure this much. Where in the other way, it's actually not clipping. Interesting. It would normally show up in red, I believe, for highlight clipping. And you can use that to, when you bring an image in, so if I go to this like crazy dark one, and I look at this little arrow right here, it's showing that, I mean, a good 2/3 to 3/4 of the data at least is being clipped out of this picture, meaning that it's really no good unless I want it to actually be pure black. But what we really care about is if I say, oh, I want to increase the exposure in this image, I can bring this exposure up and it will try to help. But if I actually zoom in to like any of these areas where it's black, which is probably this chair, anything that has to do with the TV, it's not actually, there actually isn't any detail over there. All it's doing is attempting to brighten that in terms of gray. So if you look at the histogram, there's these weird spikes. So basically just picked some pixels and bumped those up in terms of a gray amount. So there actually still isn't any detail in there. So if I tried to like print this image out and I looked really close, there wouldn't be anything there. Same with this crazy white image. If I lower, this one was a little bit better than the black one. It moved this data down, so it's actually useful now. It's a usable image. But there's this weird spike right here, which I'm sure is this light, where it was too bright, so it was pure white, and there isn't any data there anymore. So it's not really usable in terms of editing purposes. So you just kind of have to think about whether you're actually losing any data when you're taking a picture, because you can recover a lot of that in Lightroom. If I'm looking at a picture like this, where it's not completely lost, I would just, I don't know, I messed up shooting the picture. I can just increase the exposure. Suddenly, it is a perfectly usable picture. And I can just mess with this like any normal picture. You can only really do this in pictures where you're shooting, where you're gathering all of the data. That means you're shooting in RAW mode instead of JPEG. So you have to check that on your camera. RAW just means that every single bit of information that your camera picks up as it shoots is kept in the image file at the end, instead of being compressed to make the image file smaller for use later, which is what a JPEG does. Shooting in RAW is basically what every professional photographer does, and anyone who, takes photography fairly seriously. JPEGs are useful if you want a smaller file size, or you know kind of that you are getting the correct exposure when you take the picture. But if you know that maybe you're going to be a little bit off, or you're going to edit these later, keeping it in RAW is going to be the best practice, especially if you have a card that can take that amount of size. With a JPEG, you still have these controls in Lightroom, but it'll start messing with stuff a lot earlier. You won't be able to push this as far. Because, I pushed this up over three stops, and the picture basically looks completely fine. If I do that with a JPEG, it would start losing information because it already got threw that out when it compressed it in your camera. Basic kind of. I don't know, that's basically the difference between RAW and JPEG. So any questions with that, you can just hit me up on chat. It's a little bit complicated, but when you're shooting, it makes things a lot easier. So then let me go back to this guy where I wanted to actually edit. So this one is pretty much properly exposed. Just because, the camera chose the correct exposure when I was doing this aperture priority mode. So we don't really need to mess with that. But what we can do is, it has these huge spikes. maybe you want to make those different spikes kind of be in different areas or flatten those out a little bit to give us better data overall, make the picture a little bit more dynamic. So these 4 sliders right here in Lightroom will actually just mess with the different portions of the image. And what you can see, you can kind of see them if you hover over them. It like picks out the different parts of the image. So highlights is the very top quarter. Shadows is kind of the bottom. It's not the very bottom, but it's close to it. Whites, it's not the very top, but it's close to it. And then blacks is the very bottom. So if you want to target that area of the picture and kind of move that around. So maybe I want to increase how bright the lens is right here. So I bumped that all the way up. And it made the lens brighter. We can look at what that did to the data. Is it just moved all the stuff that was down there up and kind of flattened it out. So this can be good if you have something that's really, really dark. You want to brighten that up, get a little bit more detail back. You can increase the black level. Let me lower that back down. On the other side, these highlights, if I bring that down, see it brought off kind of this bright edge that was around everything. The data right over here, it just kind of moved it down and flattened it a little bit. So this is obviously great for like getting skies to kind of have some more detail in them. Yeah, stuff like that where it's just like really bright. Move that back. Shadows, you actually can see quite a big difference. Apparently everything that was under the table was actually in shadow. So we can affect that and make it brighter. And it gives us a lot of that detail back. You can suddenly see this stuff that's in the carpet, like these details. And so if you're shooting and there's like a shadow in your picture, you bring up the shadow amount, suddenly you can see all those things that were in the shadow. On the other hand, you can obviously bring that all the way back down and make it really dark. Some of the shadows actually on the lens as well, and on that box. Last one, whites, which is actually where most of the data in this picture is. If I move that down, it'll just kind of decrease the brightness overall of the picture. It doesn't do a ton. But then if I go all the way up to the other side, it's actually blowing out like the entire table. So using these 4 sliders, we can adjust the picture to kind of get the exposure that we want, not just in the picture overall, but in the different points of the picture. Increasing some of the dark areas, decreasing some of the bright areas, so everything kind of has this mid-exposure if we want that. Or you can kind of make it so everything is crazy, like contrasty, by lowering the blacks and shadows and increasing the highlights and whites to kind of do that. There is a slider up here for just contrast, which will mess with all of them. And if you move it up, it'll actually it'll kind of separate all of the data. If you go the other way, it'll kind of move them together. This picture's a little weird because these big spikes, but on contrast is fairly easy to understand. Some of these other things in Lightroom, so down here, clarity, vibrance, and saturation. Saturation and vibrance mess with the colors, though they actually target different kinds of colors slightly. If you move it up they're kind of crazy. Clarity will set that back down to where it was. Clarity will actually look for the different lines in your image, and it will increase like the saturation in those areas to make the picture appear sharper, as well as give it a little bit more pop. If you go the other way, it'll soften like everything. So all these sliders up here, and this is the general or the basic tab in Lightroom, will make it so you can adjust pictures basically to what you want in terms of exposure and color. These are actually all of the parameters that your camera will go through and convert when you take a JPEG image, because it's taking that raw data and then it's moving it, giving that little bit extra pop and saturation and stuff to make the picture look better immediately. But then, of course, it gets rid of these options later. RAW, when it comes first out of the camera, doesn't look that great, which discourages some people. When it first comes out, everything looks kind of like not saturated at all. There's like no contrast. It's not a picture that you would show really anybody. But then just with like a little bit of editing, I mean, you can probably edit an image with these parameters in like a couple of minutes, and instantly you have a picture that's not only better than the JPEG that your camera thought would be good, but also you can still mess with it later. So more good things about RAW. Any questions from the chat room? I've been talking about a lot of stuff. I'm sure you want to know about something. Final formats, TIFF, almost always. Just because it keeps all the info, it's like completely uncompressed, which makes it enormous most of the time. But if there's any inkling of you going back and using the image later, having that in TIFF format is way better. If I'm going to like export it for like the web or like to show somebody, I'll usually use a PNG. So yeah, TIFFs they keep everything. They're being completely uncompressed keeps a lot of the data. So despite the fact that they're enormous, I think it's better to have options later. So that's why I like TIFF. Plus, especially if I'm like editing in Photoshop afterwards, because there definitely are a lot of things that you can't do in Lightroom, then I'll still save it as a TIFF because it's actually better than PSDs because they keep all the layers as well as all the data basically from the raw file. One thing that I did talk about a little bit before, the dynamic range of the camera, lights to darks. I mean, it's generally good for most pictures. I mean, even like this picture, any of the pictures I took, the range is fine for like, you can still see details in the shadows for the most part without like ruining other stuff. But sometimes you can't get that range that you need. Cameras, actually, the dynamic range is anywhere between like 10 to 15 stops of light, where our eyes are around 21, which is actually one of the reasons why some people, they'll take a picture thinking that it's going to be exactly the same as what their eyes can see, but then they notice that the picture actually lost almost like everything that was down below or everything that was up high, just because the dynamic range of that camera and the sensor in the camera can't kind of detail that. So to kind of get around that in general, you can do a thing called bracketing. which I will, let me take some pictures real quick. You're basically taking multiple pictures of exactly the same thing at different exposures in order to grab the details from every single different area. So let me take those real quick. It's not going to be the most exciting because I'm just kind of sitting in a room. So basically what we want to do, my camera actually does have a bracketing setting where you can actually tell it to take, when you take 3 pictures, it'll actually take one that's underexposed, one that's at proper exposure, and one that's overexposed. And so that you have those for later use in Lightroom. I mean, I'll have them for immediate use. So let's see. For web portfolio stuff, I actually do use PNGs. Yeah, the loading times are not super great. But yeah, the problems with the JPEGs is, yeah, most of the pictures that I take get really weird color stuff, which I work really hard to kind of preserve after I take them and I'm editing them. So I think PNGs are probably the best. I mean, I prefer to have it be a long load time than have the picture be crappy in the end. Though generally, like in my portfolio, I actually have smaller pictures that people can look at, and then if they want to see the full thing, I'll actually load the full one, and that doesn't seem to weird people out too much. Yeah. So in Lightroom, it took the 3 pictures. They're not a ton different. This first one is the proper exposure according to the camera. This one is underexposed, 1 stop, and this one is overexposed, 1 stop. So we can see that it kind of grabs different detail in different areas, which is exactly what we want. Like in this underexposed one, it actually didn't get a whole lot of like detail right around the lens, whereas this slightly overexposed one grabbed absolutely all the detail, and that's what we wanted. So, but here we have 3 images. So what we can actually do in Lightroom is create something called an HDR. Photo merge. In Lightroom, it says photo merge HDR. I actually have other tools that I generally use for this, but so what HDRs are is high dynamic range. So it'll take multiple images, take the different spots in the image that are exposed differently, and try to combine them into one image that has a higher dynamic range than your camera is actually capable of. And so it's more akin to the eye. You generally actually see these on the internet as crazy looking images that actually have dynamic ranges that are bigger than the eye, which makes them look really weird to us because that's something that you can't see naturally. I mean, if you just type in HDR into Google, it will give you all kinds of crazy stuff, which can be fun. But so here's what Lightroom thinks is the best of all 3 of those images. I guess I agree, because in Lightroom it actually doesn't give you any options for changing stuff. Couple things in here though, you can actually take pictures that are slightly off and it'll line it for you and it'll tone it for you in here. So if I hit merge, it'll think about it for a little bit and put those into one image. What this is actually more useful for is just like images that, like, you want something maybe in the middle of the day but the sky is too bright. So you take one where it's underexposed to get that sky detail, and then you take a normal one to get the detail of just like everything else, and that will give you the right picture overall when you combine them in Lightroom. or Photoshop or some other program into an HDR. So I'll generally use those when, like if you're in like a canyon or something, you'll take a picture and the sky will be blown out because it has to overexpose a lot to get any detail at all from the stuff down in the canyon. But then you have to underexpose to get that sky, and then you combine them together to get one good image that actually doesn't look too unnatural because it's about what your eye is going to see anyways. So here's the final image in all of its glory. This lens is very dirty. So yeah, using all kinds of exposure tricks to kind of get one image that is better than the other ones, I hope. It's probably actually really similar to this middle one. But with just a little bit more brightness on the camera itself to show more detail. So yeah. Any questions on dynamic ranges or exposure things or anything really that we've talked about at all? Probably pretty close to ending the stream. Yeah, I don't know. There's nobody here. Like compared to Emily Madison's stupid stream this morning, there's like nobody here. There's no weird guy hitting on me. How was the audio and the video and stuff in this one? Haven't really been checking. I don't have anybody to like look at it, so. Okay. You can look at our stream on the stream. Yeah, that's pretty much everything. Just gonna go over. Yeah, I don't know if Nightbot's actually doing anything. Yeah, I'll probably have to set up the commands for Nightbot. Yeah, who else is here besides Dick? Let's see. Yeah, the count. Yeah, it's just yeah. Only two people really. and then the bot. It's counting me also as a viewer because I'm looking at it on my phone. Okay, so I think I'm gonna end the stream. See you guys later.